Hello, welcome to the Hudson Institute. My name is Harold Furch-Roth, and I'll be your host today. We are live streamed as well, and we'll take some questions from the audience. If you're watching online and you have a question, send it to, I think, events at Hudson should do the trick. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us Jim Lewis, Senior Vice President at CSIS. He is, I think, very accurately described as having a track record of being among the first to identify new tech and security issues and provide policies to address them. Jim is always prescient about particularly issues at the intersection of technology and national security. And that is exactly what we're looking forward to hearing you speak about today, about 5G and spectrum and national security, a very pressing topic. And so thank you very much for joining us, Jim.
Thank you.
Look forward to your remarks, and then I have a bunch of questions for you, and I'm sure our audience will as well.
Good. Thanks for having me here, and hi to everyone. So one thing that I think is generally perceived is that the nature of national security has changed. So it's not the 20th century anymore. Sometimes that's a shock to people, but it's not. And so the grounds for competition have changed significantly. And they involve, as we all know, China and technology, right? And this is not the Cold War, it's not the war on terror, it's a different kind of conflict. And it's not fair to compare it to a war, but it's definitely a contest. The Chinese have an intention to reclaim, they would say, reclaim their rightful place at the center of the world stage. They are displeased with what they perceive as American hegemony. And that hegemony includes technological hegemony. And so I've had the Chinese complaining to me about this, various Chinese, for more than a decade. I know a member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences told me 20 years ago that it wasn't fair that everything in China depended on US chips, that was a vulnerability, that we'd built backdoors into our chips. And it's not true, but it's nice that they think that. It has inspired them, along with the desire for economic growth, along with the desire for political hegemony, inspired them to build sort of their own technological ecosystem. And at the center of that is 5G, semiconductors. Those are the two technologies that will drive growth and security, not only in China, but in the rest of the world. So it is a competition. The US is a little handicapped, and some of my Chinese friends tell me the Americans are so happy with how well they did in the 20th century that they have a hard time giving it up. And that will be one of the themes today, is that we have a penchant for things that worked well 30 years ago, maybe not so well now. Where does 5G fit into this? 5G. And so it's fun living in Washington because it's always, what is the buzzword of the month? This month, of course, it's artificial intelligence, probably a bubble that will continue along the lines of metaverse and cryptocurrency. 5G, however, is part of a larger, and AI too, part of a larger technological environment that will reshape societies and economies, and as a result, reshape national power. It is a combination of cloud computing, of artificial intelligence, of software skills. You've heard about Open Radio Access Network, which is simply transforming the telecom system into something more like the internet, to IP-based networks that are cloud dependent. And in this new environment, the nature of competition will change, not only among countries, but among companies, right? 5G is just the latest of new generations of telecommunications technology. Obviously, it's 5, right? The big one was probably 3G. That's where a lot of the world still uses it. 4G, very important because 4G was the smartphone. 4G was the app economy. 4G was the move to a consumer-oriented phone where your phone became your train ticket, your checking account, your boarding pass. 4G was consumer-centric. It was valuable and it had tremendous effect. 5G is not consumer-centric, however. 5G is aimed at enterprises. 5G is aimed at commercial activity because it will create opportunities to streamline and change the way we have seen this happen with other technologies. And of course, people say, well, if you say that, why isn't it happening yet? It is happening. It may not be visible. It's happening at a faster rate. One of the things that's changed in the last few years is the rate of technological change has increased. Our ability to make noise about it has also increased, but our ability to understand it, perhaps not so much. But 5G will be looking at factories, at hospitals, at public spaces. It's not going to be faster downloading of videos on your phone, right? It will be that, but it will be more. And one of the complaints is, well, why hasn't it happened? Harold probably remembers there was a Nobel Prize winning economist who said in 1990, it was something along the lines of, you can see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. He was right for that snapshot. He wasn't right for the long-term trend. So the long-term trend is, how do you take advantage of this new networking capability to get greater economic growth? And one of the conclusions, or one of the opening points of some of the reports we've done 3 now, is that it has a nice quote from a 19th century British song. We have the men, we have the ships, we have the money too, right? They were talking about fighting over Seattle, by the way. Having money is important. And so one thing I'd point to is, if you look at the European Union, flat economic growth because of their fear of digital technology. And that means they can't afford a robust defense, right? We don't want flat economic growth. We don't have flat economic growth, but neither does China. So we're in a competition where economic growth, the ability to innovate, will be crucial determinants for what sort of system we have going forward, what sort of governance system for the world. It has been the American system created after 1945. That's fraying, if not disintegrating. The Chinese wish to replace it. To maintain our concern for rule of law, for human rights, we will need to be economically successful, and that's where 5G becomes important. The US does have some disadvantages, though, and so in the last report we did, I call it first mover disadvantage. First mover advantage is one of these VC terms that you hear a lot. We discovered the benefits of wireless technology decades ago, well before the rest of the world. And that means that a lot of government systems rely on wireless access. And they have occupied what someone used to call the beachfront property in spectrum. Spectrum is simply the radio waves. It's finite. There's only so much you can do. You can create technologies that will make better use of the existing radio spectrum, but it's not like we can go out and make more. So people who have spectrum are loath to give it up. And that's difficult because one of the things that 5G will require is that we are able to move from activities of lesser value to activities of greater value. And that was true in 4G. That's true. We've seen that all over, right? This is what happens with technological change. You used to have horses, and now you have cars. You used to have elevator operators. Now you push a button. It increases productivity. By the way, just as a footnote, that will not diminish employment. This has been a myth for at least a century. It's not true. People will have different jobs. It will destroy some jobs, but it will create more new ones. Part of this change will be the ability to use wireless technologies. And you wonder what you always have the gee whiz stories. So like You can do remote surgery. You can have some guy walking around a plant. You can combining it with some of the virtual reality devices and the cloud computing that gives you access to huge amounts of data. Somebody can look at a jet engine and see what the problem is without having to go and thumb through some 3,000-page manual. There's a lot of benefits. The one that was my favorite was if you see like a football game, they have cameras, and the cameras are fixed. They're hardwired to a truck that then has a satellite connection. And so they have to have fixed positions. They can't roam around that easily because they're tethered to the satellite truck. With 5G, when it gets there, you'll just be able to walk around with the camera, right? So, and all the people who televise sports events are very interested in this. But so are factories, so are manufacturers, so is the military, so are the people who do healthcare. This will be a change in how people use digital technologies that will increase efficiency and use. There's a dilemma, and that gets back to the first mover advantage. Remember I said the US was first to figure it out. You can hold your applause. First to figure it out. And so we have most of the spectrum, let me rephrase that. Most of the spectrum left for 5G is already occupied by government uses, right? So an easy way to think about it is high, medium, and low bands. You're using spectrum right now. The visible spectrum is what is reflecting onto the receivers as eyes, and then you're interpreting that signal. For devices, you use different spectrums, and the US has done pretty well at allocating the low band for 5G. The US has done pretty well at allocating the high band for 5G, still needs some work there. We've done a terrible job at allocating the mid-band, which unfortunately is the sweet spot for a lot of commercial activities. It's already held by government users. Now, and Harold will know this well, we used to have a process for helping people move. That process was known as the Spectrum Reallocation Fund, where you're the incumbent, you're a government incumbent. The administration decides, and this began in the Bush administration, decides that you should move, but you should be compensated for your move. So the spectrum you have is auctioned. They get money, FCC gets money, and then they use it to compensate you for having to move. That seemed like a good plan to me, but unfortunately Congress didn't renew the auction authorities. And some of the government incumbents don't want to move. They say it's a pain, we have to buy new technology, we have to ask permission. So we're kind of stuck when it comes to that mid-band. Why is this important? Well, first, mid-band will help with economic growth and military power because it will enable 5G. But more importantly, the rest of the world has moved on. We are not the leaders anymore. The most salient example was a couple of years ago. This is actually what started this second round of spectrum projects for us. FAA announced that if 5G was turned on by airports, airplanes would fall from the sky, right? Golly, that's really scary. Apparently the laws of physics are different in the United States than they are in the rest of the world, because in no other country was this a problem. I was a little annoyed. The BBC had an article about airplane fears cause 5G delay, but they didn't mention that when you go fly into Heathrow, it's surrounded by 5G. Everywhere else in the world has moved to reallocate or allocate this mid-band spectrum to more valuable uses, and we're kind of stuck. Because our administrative system is damaged, I don't have to tell you about the potential for gridlock in the US government. Because Congress didn't renew a key authority, because the bureaucratic politics of allocation haven't worked that well. And there's a lot on people's plate, so I'm not being critical, but we do have to come to this decision point of how do we move old users to different spectrum and reallocate their spectrum to higher value use. It's always been a problem. I thought we had a solution with the Spectrum Reallocation Fund. Now, one thing that comes up, the way I got into this was right when I started at CSIS, James Schlesinger and Robert Galvin, CEO of Motorola, and Schlesinger, of course, you know, decided to set up a commission to look at the spectrum allocation process. It's funny for me because it's very much the same problem we face now. Incumbent users, how move them? Solution we came up with was the Spectrum Reallocation Fund. But Schlesinger also had this hope that spectrum sharing technologies would save us. Spectrum sharing means you can cram more users. So think of it as a single band, a single highway. How many cars can you fit on that highway? Spectrum sharing technologies allow you to fit more cars on that highway. So that's great. We won't have these nasty, expensive political fights over moving incumbents. We'll just all share. Dilemma is it doesn't work. Maybe it'll work someday in the future, but right now we don't have an adequate technological solution. So that's kind of where we are. Competition with China, rest of the world has moved on. You will see evidence of this, and you know this part well. There's, what's it called, the World Radiological Conference?
World Radio Conference.
World Radio Conference, I keep thinking radiological. There is one of those, but it's about x-rays. World Radio Conference happens every few years, and it assigns global spectrum allocations. There's 7 different issues in contention. Right now, the Chinese have positions on 6. They're going around busily lobbying the rest of the world to support them. We have a position on 1, no position on the other 6, and are therefore not lobbying anyone because there's nothing to support. So we could end up with a world, if we get this wrong, where having won the Huawei battle, having persuaded developed countries to get Huawei out of their systems, they'll end up depending on Huawei anyhow because the spectrum devices they use will be dependent on Chinese standards and Chinese thresholds. So this is not a big issue for the public. It's not a well-known issue, but it's an issue that involves tens of billions of dollars and really the foundation of national power moving forward. So I'm appreciative that we were able to have the time to talk about it. I don't know if we'll fix this one. You know, these works, they're called WRC's works. The US always goes right up to the edge, being unprepared and confused. And somehow we always manage to pull it off at the end. I'm hopeful that will happen, but this is the closest we've ever come to the edge without being ready to do anything. So some tough fights ahead. Congress needs to reauthorize the auction authorities. The US agencies, led by the administration, have to agree on what can be reallocated. And then we have to move forward to build, either we'll build the devices or the Chinese will. And there is an effort to do a spectrum strategy. That's a very positive step. I helped with the first spectrum strategy at this point 15 years ago. Now we're doing a second. The dilemma is our strategy actually recommended things to do. This strategy recommends studying things. And you all know in Washington, study is code for nothing, right? So we need to change the spectrum strategy to be a little more forward-leaning. So we have a good set of problems, a lot of money involved, some very deeply held positions. The difference between now and 15 years ago is we also have a foreign competitor. We have China breathing down our necks. And I don't mean to beat the China drum, but it's a different world than it was in the Bush administration. We have a different set of problems. And it's a good question. I'm optimistic that we'll be able to move out on spectrum, but there'll be some heavy lifting to get there. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for those comments. You referred to a series of 3 studies, and I just want to let people know this is Modernizing Spectrum Allocation to Ensure U.S. Security in the 21st Century. You can get all these at csis.org. This is by Jim and his co-author, Cleet Johnson. This is Jim's paper, Spectrum Allocation for a Contest with China from June, and the national security benefits of reallocating federal spectrum for 5G by Cleet Johnson in July.
We have one other one that predates all of these and was the ancestor called Stuck on the Runway, which is about the debates with the FAA and the inability to make a decision that although the rest of the world had decided 5G was safe, the US was having a little bit of a problem.
Jim, you referred to the first mover disadvantage, and if you look at a spectrum chart for the United States, it looks like a rainbow. You have all these different colors and different bands, and it's actually a little bit chaotic, and that's the problem with first mover disadvantage, because these allocations were actually made beginning literally back in the 1890s, because the first use were naval communications in the very low bands of the spectrum. And if you're a more recent developed country, you start from scratch, and instead of having this chaotic allocation, you can actually have bands with lots of similar colors, and probably makes a lot of sense. How do we get out of this? How do we get out of this first mover disadvantage, which arguably is greater in spectrum? I can't think of any other area where it's as much of a curse as it is here.
It is a dilemma, and I worry that sometimes the US, as my Chinese colleagues have said, is sort of caught by its earlier successes, in that it's harder for us to move. Hey, it worked so great in 1990, why change now? Some of it will be technological change. And so open radio access networks, ORAN, so I used to call it fairy dust because you had a telecom problem, you sprinkled ORAN over it and it went away. But now phone companies tell me, no, it actually works. And ORAN is basically, you combine devices at the edge, like your cell phone, like a car, like a factory, with the cloud, data and services stored in the cloud, and they communicate wirelessly and then fiber optic over a fiber optic network. So we know how this works, and it may not even require fiber optics. That change in technology will ease some of the problems. It's exogenous to policy, as long as policy doesn't get in the way. But better technology, better receivers. There used to be something called guard bands, like you remember, this is a highway. So you're on this highway, but because the receivers were so bad, you put open spaces on either side, right? So that there wouldn't be interference. And as technology has gotten better, you don't need as much open space. You don't need those guard bands. So I think technological improvement is a long-term solution, unfortunately. Short-term, we're just going to have some tough political engagements, and this is driven in good measure by the Hill. But you need that strategy, national spectrum strategy, to say, pretty much here's a process. Here's a process for the users, the engineers to get in a room and decide how we can reallocate to accommodate 5G. I think there's a willingness to do that in most of the people involved, but long-term, it's a technological fix. Short-term, some more political mud wrestling.
You mentioned the government coordination is, there's a technical economic term for this. It's a mess. I think it's just become much worse in the past 5 or 10 years than it was before. We have different agencies fighting over spectrum. We just recently had the Department of Defense review the lower 3 gigahertz and essentially saying, no, can't be done. And you've been involved in developing a national spectrum plan. How do we get out of our current mess? And part of the problem, to me, is that there's really no one in charge. You have different agencies. There's the NTIA for federal spectrum. There's the FCC. Coordination has been limited, shall we say, in recent years, to put it politely. And it just seems like no one's really in charge. What can be done?
So you hear about American uniqueness a lot, and we are unique in that we are the only country in the world that has two different agencies in charge of spectrum. And that's a bit of a problem. NTIA was created by Herbert Hoover when he was Secretary of Commerce. It's been around a while.
Well, so was the FCC.
Yeah, but a little after. So you've got these two agencies, one that does federal and one that does everything else, and they're supposed to coordinate. And sometimes they coordinate well, sometimes they don't. The other thing is you have a group of agencies, DoD is one, but the space agencies, the agencies that use radio devices who have very strong feelings about relocation of spectrum use. And they've become a little more fractious in the past few years, and I'm not quite sure why that is. At one point, it would have been unthinkable for FAA to come in and say, no, FCC, sorry, you've made a mistake. Your decision that 5G is safe to use is wrong, right? Now, ultimately, even though the rest of the world was on FCC's side, ultimately it came out the right way, but that sort of speed bump makes it difficult for us to be competitive economically and in other areas. We talked about, in this Schlesinger Commission, merging NTIA and FCC, and a lot of people thought that was a good idea, but it just doesn't seem to be in the cards for Washington. I will say that within the White House now, there's a strong interest in improving spectrum management, largely driven out of the NSC. We'll see where they get. I think the National Spectrum Strategy is a vehicle for them to do that. But you are right in the sense that there has to be strong leadership that works well with Congress and keeps the agencies in line. That's not that different from any other federal management problem, but spectrum is a little more complicated because of all the money and because of the lack of public attention. But I think that's the solution is think about, we're not going to get a better system than what we have now, where you have multiple agencies involved in the spectrum allocation process. So it's just making it work better. And that falls largely on the White House, the FCC, and the committees of jurisdiction.
If we just look at, let's just for a moment look at the lower 3 gigahertz. As you mentioned, incredibly valuable for commercial use. Pentagon says incredibly valuable for military use. There's been a kind of a complaint, if you will, or observation, I'll put it that way, from the agencies, but particularly from the Pentagon, that spectrum, compensating them for spectrum will actually just get washed away by OMB and by the budget process. And yeah, all right, so it's going to cost them $50 billion, $100 billion, or whatever, but they're actually never going to see it. Is this just bureaucratic intransigence, or is there something to this that there's a difficulty in getting the funds from the auction actually to the parties that are going to have to give it up?
It looks a lot from the outside like negotiation tactics, because in negotiation, you always start by saying it can't be done, it's impossible. By the way, it will be fabulously expensive, and the money you have isn't enough. This is like buying a car, right? And so there's a lot of parallels with a negotiation that makes me suspect these are negotiating ploys. There were problems with the spectrum reallocation fund, some of which we worked through and some of which we didn't. One problem was OMB doesn't want agencies getting money without their CHOP, without their approval. And so that the original idea, you give up spectrum, you get money. No, it has to go through OMB, and it has to be consistent with whatever you put in the budget requests you made. So it's ultimately still under White House control. That was the Bush administration. The second issue, same thing, jurisdiction. The committees that have jurisdiction over this, they don't want you getting money without their say-so, right? So they said, no, it has to be. But those problems, OMB committees, those were largely worked through. There's still issues, and you have to be cognizant of them. The harder problem was the cap on how much you could actually get from spectrum reallocation funds and what you could spend it on. You could spend it to replace what you had. Probably careless drafting, of which I would probably share some of the guilt. But of course, if you want to buy new technology, that makes it a little more difficult, right? And so the original theory was, well, we're giving you money to upgrade. There were some drafting issues, some terminology issues. You couldn't spend on R&D. You could only do a replacement one for one. You couldn't use it for an upgrade. That still needs to be fixed. So making spectrum reallocation funds, if they become available again after auction is reauthorized, if it is, a little more flexible for the agencies. And two things to bear in mind in this when it comes to some equipment. First, DoD, for example, they operate globally. So if they're in countries where they've already reallocated the mid-band, they've figured out a way to deal with it, right? That may not be exactly what we can do here, but in a global environment, we are the outlier. The second issue is that you've got very old equipment. I would think that the idea of getting money to upgrade it, and so you're seeing this now with the AWACS, the E3, which is the airborne warning aircraft. It's from the 1970s, yeah. Right? And we could probably do a little better than 1970. Anyone here still driving a 1970s car? No. Or using a 1970, they didn't have cell phones in 1970, 1970s computer. There would be a real benefit to upgrading our technology, but in fact, the Japanese and the Australians already have an E3 upgrade. It's called Wedgetail, that is consistent with 5G use. We could just buy theirs. We make it, but they have the rights to it. So I think that the issues to bear in mind is it has to be a global solution, which we don't have now, because we operate globally and because we compete globally for markets. And second, it's an opportunity to upgrade some of the older technologies that are still in use in DoD. The E3A is everyone's pet example because it's so spectrum heavy in its use.
You mentioned China several times, and clearly that's a big focus, both in terms of national security policy and 5G issues. 5G has been part of the national 5-year plan of China for about a decade. Lots of countries have had 5-year plans with technology. This seems to me to be one of the rare exceptions, maybe the only example, where a country has decided to take on a development of a technology from a centralized planning point of view and arguably succeeded at it. What does this mean? I've been very troubled that a country can actually use centralized planning to develop a technology. It seems very counterintuitive from an economic perspective. Have the Chinese succeeded in this area, or is that not exactly what's going on?
So it is a benefit to have central planning. There is no disputes. There are no interagency disputes that reach this level in China because Xi Jinping merely squashes the side he doesn't agree with. And we can't do that here, so he's got an advantage. The dilemma, of course, is what if he's bet on the wrong horse? No one will dare tell him that, and so the Chinese misallocate a lot of money. But when they get it right, they have an advantage. Open question about how that will play out over the long term. I'm still confident that competition is more likely to drive. They have a lot of problems, and one of their problems is it's more difficult for the Chinese to innovate, to create new technologies because their political space is closing. And there's a link. Less political freedom, less innovation. They don't necessarily like to admit that, at least in public. But we have some advantages, but China in 5G did identify it early on. Part of that was everyone looks upon the US success in 4G. And so 4G is a space that we dominated. We dominated the standards, and the standards process is you say, this is how something should be built. Everything's built to the same standard, so it works, it interoperates. But the standard holder, the standard creator gets revenue from that. And so when you think of Qualcomm or Intel or some of the other big companies, we benefited from 4G because we created the standards, and the Chinese saw that and said, hey, I want a piece of the standard action. And they decided to get into 5G. They have this obsession with leapfrogging, by the way, that they know they can't catch up, so they'll leapfrog and go to the next. 5G was a natural for them. There's pros and there's cons to that. The con is that the pro is, if they decide it's a national investment priority, they don't have government shutdowns, they don't have interagency. They do have interagency debates, but they're more easily resolved when the leadership has made up its mind. The con is that they live in the same world we live in, which is their interdependent supply chains. And part of the battle over spectrum allocation, over standard setting, is who will shape this interdependent world? Who will set the rules for interdependence? We do right now with our allies, Japan and the Europeans. The Chinese would like to displace us because if you do that, people have to pay you to build the technology you will need for your phone, for your car, for your factory. And they see that as a huge revenue stream. In some ways, there's a principle in sociology where if you tell somebody that this is what you're going to be measuring them on, they perform to that measure. And I feel like we screwed up a little bit. We told the Chinese that one of the things you measure success on is number of patents. So they crank out tens of thousands of patents every year. Most of them aren't picked up, right? So if you look at the number of patents, China leads. If you look at the number of patents that are used to set standards, standard essential patents, the US still leads, but the Chinese know this and they're doing better. So we could find ourselves in an interdependent world, a world where technology is created through global supply chains, which means multiple players and multiple companies, but sitting at the apex could be China. That's what the debate is about.
I have lots more questions, but I think it would be unfair for me to monopolize the
No, I'm
questions.
having fun. Let's.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience. Please, if you ask a question, please identify yourself, and so that our audience, our online audience, can recognize the speaker. Questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Rajendra Singh from the World Bank, just next door. My question is, you mentioned that technology solution is kind of the long-term solution. I feel it's not a question of technology development. Technology is there, but when it comes to spectrum, it's a question of the industry, how they are going to adopt the technology. I'll just make very brief comments about NSF about, I think, 2 decades back, they did a study about how spectrum is being utilized, allocated spectrum. And at that time, it was all mostly sub 2 gigahertz. And the utilization factor was very, very low. The second point is, if you see from 2G to 5G, the spectral efficiency, like in 1 unit of frequency, how much data we can pump in, the factor has gone up to like 10 or 15 this thing. How much really we are caring about efficient utilization of this. My third point is, today, and you mentioned in your presentation, like going from 700 megahertz low frequency to millimeter wave and this. So the allocated spectrum is very wide today. But the issue is, if we analyze our communication requirement, about 70 to 80%, we are within the buildings, whether our home, our office, or any this thing. And the spectrum requirement for in-building communications are totally different from the outdoor this thing. But the industry is somehow not able to appreciate the different utilization of this spectrum for indoor coverage. Of course, everything will be expensive, but the question is, our managers, are they going to agree that, I'll forego my billions of dollars, but you come out with very innovative ideas, how this finite resource can be utilized very efficiently. So to summarize, the point is not about technology limitation. The receiver example, what you gave, I mean, with the AI, with the radio unit, distribution unit, centralized unit, disaggregated completely, so much virtualization, so much softwareization in the equipment, I think a lot can be done as far as technology is concerned. The last point I want to make about 5G and FAA and aircraft and this issue. Ofcom did a very detailed paper and exercise on this. I was like surprised why this kind of exercise was not possible or this thing, because they even measured, like if aircraft is landing and there is a 5G tower in the landing path, what is the possibility, how exactly such a detailed calculation? Thank you very much.
Well, there's a lot in that one, so let me try and do as much as I can remember. On the aircraft one, again, it's people tend to use old technology, so you have these radio altimeters. I'll give you an example, which is I was talking to someone from one of the armed services who was a squadron commander, and the FAA, trying to tilt the scales a little bit, put out a notice to airmen saying, if you see any trouble because of 5G, let us know. And so he got all these reports from people in a squadron saying they'd seen interference. The problem was that what they were flying over, there was no 5G deployed. So suggestion is very powerful. I think that the US was a little overconfident. FCC was expected that people would defer to them, and they didn't. They did good work. Their engineers are solid, but they weren't expecting this objection. On the technology side, I'm a little less optimistic in the near term. I don't know how you want to define near, say end of the decade. Partially because I've been through this a couple times. We thought technology would save us in 2007. It will eventually save us and things get better. So you're right for something more than, but I need a solution now. I don't need a solution in 2035, right? And so that's where technology will continue to improve. It will give us alternate paths, but it has not done so yet. And people, even the people who on both sides of this debate agree that spectrum sharing technology is not there yet. It will be eventually. The other factor to think about is the growth in data usage. And that's where, so one thing about the different spectrum levels is they have different capacities, different capabilities. So in its range, its ability to penetrate within buildings, its amount of data they can carry. So each high, medium, low, each has different characteristics that make it beneficial for some cases, not so beneficial for others. And if you've driven across country and your mobile phone loses service when you're in between towers, that's something that could be fixed with a different allocation. So part of what's driving it too is that people how many cell phone towers do I need to deploy? They're expensive. Some spectrums mean spectrum means I can deploy less. Some spectrum means I can carry more data. So it's a complicated business decision, but the context here is the growth in the use of data, which is simply astounding. And so when you look at what a car will use, a car is basically a rolling computer now, and of course, there's a big fight over how do we connect it to the world is being enveloped in a global network, and your car will be connected to it, right? And it will be pumping out data. When you fly on an airplane, a commercial airplane, the jet engine is communicating with its maintenance hub and the manufacturer, independent of the pilot. It's communicating with the European Union for had a squabble. Did that qualify as personal information because the engine was a discrete entity? A little silly, but you've got so much more demand for the ability to carry data wirelessly that's part of why I think, while it's true in the long term, I expect that we will find technological solutions. We can't necessarily wait for the long term, and cars are a good example. Who's going to build this smart car, the EV of the future? Well, it can be us or it can be them. And one of the things that will happen, depending on how we decide on spectrum allocation, will help shape that outcome.
Just a quick note, your car engine actually communicates directly back to the auto manufacturer without your knowledge or input as well. Next
Tried to
question.
turn that off, but I'm not sure I succeeded.
Probably can't, yeah. Next question. Yes, in the back, and then.
David McGarry from Taxpayers Protection Alliance. There's been a lot of recent reporting about China's economic troubles, a lot specifically focused on the finance sector, the real estate sector. How is China's telecom sector doing?
Well, first of all, I was really, really happy when Xi Jinping decided that he was going to double down on Marxism, because it's like, that's great. The biggest policy failure of the 20th century, and you've decided to become a Marxist. Cool. So again, long term, if we can keep our act in gear here in Washington, we will prevail, right? Because nobody wins betting on Marxism. The telecom sector is a little bit different than the financial sector, in part because a lot of the problems, many of the problems in China are a result of the real estate bubble. Sound familiar? Not US, Japan, but the huge real estate bubble. 30% of their GDP growth was from real estate. Come on, give me a break. So they have a huge debt overhang. You have the government financing system with the provinces and the municipalities also getting into the loan business. So their debt, people here moan about the federal debt. You should live in China. So they have debt problems. Telecom's a little different for two reasons. One, they recognize it's a strategic industry. We used to think that, and we forgot it for a while. They did not, and so they're willing to pump money into it. It is much more government directed than things here. There's pros and there's cons to that, but in general, they have access to resources that our companies generally do not, right? So they don't have the same problems that the Europeans have with setting pricing on service. So overall, I'd say the telecom sector is one of the success stories for China. And of course, they're competing globally. You have China Telecom going around the world. You have the same merge that you have here. You know, it's telecom companies like China Telecom, but it's also internet companies like Alibaba or Amazon who are in this space. So they are powerful competitors globally. They offer good services, and they don't have some of the political constraints or financial constraints that American companies have. In the long term, it's been so far an equal. The losers in this just across the board are the Europeans, and whatever they're doing, they've got it wrong. So we and the Chinese are in a competition. The Europeans have dropped out. But in this case, in telecom, they are probably, why are you thinking of investing? I can give you investment advice. I would not buy Chinese telecom stock right now for a whole set of reasons, but none of them are financial. So no, the sector is doing well.
I would just add that if you look at to the extent you can rely on Chinese economic data, which is, there's a question mark there, but to the extent you can, a really, really bad year is such as they just had, which I think was something like 3% economic growth. In the United States, a politician is thought to be a lunatic if they think we can sustain 3 or 4% economic growth. So the expectations are dramatically different on the growth of the economy between the United States and China. They expect, their political leaders want 10% economic growth. They rarely get there. But when they have growth that is greater than the United States, that's a bad year. Lady in front.
Snezhana Jelkovic, Eagle Project. I would like your comments and your view because today was Spectrum and national security, and haven't heard much of what I see as American security, in the sense that, I mean, you're talking about economics, telecom, innovation, great. How can we address critical infrastructure protection with we know China, I mean, grid has become a weapon of war, like it was said at Davos. So there are two things that I would like your perspective on. One is the lack of complete imagination from the telecom sector when it comes to innovation, because they first, it seems to me, they first work out the ecosystem and then they try to apply to some kind of technology instead of looking at innovation and build around the innovation. That's one point. And the second point is, could we envision spectrum allocation dedicated for critical infrastructure with an innovative technology? Voilà. So I would like to see, what do you think of those 2 points?
Great. Let me start with the first one, and I probably didn't do justice to Open Radio Access Networks, ORAN, which is now a successful technology. And when I started tracking ORAN, I don't know, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it was unusual because for the first time in the telecom business in decades, you had startups. Right? And Mavenir's the one everyone knows about now because they've moved beyond being a startup. But you had the same startup culture, small companies, innovative technologies that you see in other parts of the tech space moving into telecom. It was really unusual. It was a little threatening to the incumbents, threatening to Huawei, which was good, but threatening to our Nordic friends, which was not so good. They've worked something out. But you see the use of ORAN, the use of cloud, the use of 5G, bringing back innovation into the telecom sector. I was like, what's it called, SS7? Is that? There's a telecom standard that the federal government had me study when I was a child. I couldn't understand it. That was like 30 years ago. And in some places, they're still using it. We're past those days now, right, as you move to IP networks. So it's a very different world. You do see innovation. And the more telecom and computing merge, the more of that you'll see. You know, so they have what they call white box telecom, which is, you know, instead of, it used to be you bought, you know, from, the handset was from the same company. You bought, the handset was Huawei, and the radio access network was Huawei, and the cloud was Huawei, and the backbone was Huawei, and everything. It was a vertical integration. We're starting to see horizontal integration now, and that means more space for innovation. So on that one, I think just the merge of compute and telecom means you'll get a more innovative environment and probably a lower cost environment. And it looks like maybe a more reliable environment. That used to be a problem, it's not. The first one that is a little more complicated, I think people have tried dedicated spectrum for critical infrastructure. And there's a whole set of problems involved. The easiest one, I was talking to an executive at a big electric company once, and he said that what drove a lot of their deployments was it's raining really hard. the guy has to drive by in a truck to check on an installation, it's easier for him to set in the truck and connect wirelessly to see what's up with whatever the infrastructure is. This was electrical. But on the other hand, the flip side is they can't have everyone having their own password. So they use the same password for all of the drivers and all of the installations. That would be bad security. They've made some improvements since then, but what you'll probably see, and this is where 5G could be useful, is you have an ability called network slicing. And slicing is, you have a spectrum, it's allocated for a certain use, but part of it is reserved for a particular use, for a hospital, for example, so you don't get service interruptions, or for Netflix, so you don't get people calling up to complain that their show was interfered with. That kind of network slicing is probably the solution rather than dedicated spectrum per se. But that's something you can do with 5G. So I sound like I'm a salesman for 5G here now, but in some ways it is kind of a cool technology. And that's more likely than dedicated bands. They used to have, back in the olden days, nobody wanted spectrum, so your uses were government, broadcast military, and taxi cab radios. That was it, folks. But them days are gone, right? Now everybody wants a piece of the spectrum. And that means you probably won't see a dedicated allocation like I think you were talking about, but you will see technologies that allow you to have consistent service.
If I may just add a bit, I think some of the questions were about security or national security. Let me just give a few examples from recent warfare about the use of spectrum and how I think it's probably not been fully appreciated. If you look at the Hamas invasion of Israel, the real-time use of social media to send back horrific war crime images and that's being done on wireless networks that I assume Israel could just shut down. I'm surprised they haven't. If you look at the war in Ukraine, drones and satellite services from particularly from Starlink have been very central in that warfare. It completely changes the landscape of warfare, the use of drones and satellite technology. Again, I don't think one expected the Ukrainians to have a very sophisticated electronic warfare. Electronic warfare could shut all of this down, could simply jam it, or spoof it or do other things to completely confuse and destroy drone systems. It turned out the Russians don't really have a very effective electronic warfare capability, and this has exposed Russia to this new type of warfare, which a more sophisticated electronic warfare entity would not be vulnerable to these types of drone attacks. Or also just the command and control that the Ukrainian military uses apparently is very heavily reliant on Starlink, which the Russians, if they wanted to, or if they were more careful about it, probably could have blocked, but they haven't.
It just really is a different kind of warfare there, right? It's still very much the traditional trench warfare and grinding and attrition, but there's this new technology overlay that people didn't expect. So I had an Israeli general tell me, this was before recent incidents, he said, Ukraine may show that the tank is going the way of the battleship. That it's so vulnerable to the drones and to this that you may need them. They're certainly nice on parades, but we're going to have to rethink how we fight wars.
Other questions? If not, please join me in thanking Jim Lewis for this wonderful session.
As I learned to applaud. It's what they